Hello, everyone in the room, and hello, everyone at home or listening secretly at your office. Welcome to The Water Sector Needs More Grit, where we're going to talk about what watershed resilience means. I'm joined by panelists today, Daniel Shemy, the Strategy Director for Resilient Watersheds at the Nature Conservancy, John Matthews, Executive Director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and last but certainly not least, Will Hughes from AWS. All right, let's kick it off, boys. We're going to be really, really tight. We only have about 15 minutes. So, John, can you start us off by setting the stage for our audience here? What do we really mean by watershed resilience? And why should the sector really care about it now? Maybe give everyone an explain like I'm five version.
Sure. I'd say that the word resilience is actually very contested right now. It's a word that it's evolving quite rapidly. There are lots of competing definitions. I'd say the older definition that is dominated by most people who've been working in water is the idea that something bad happens and then you try to go back to the way that things were before that bad thing happened. I call that Godzilla resilience. Godzilla comes up out of Tokyo Bay, wipes everything out, and you rebuild Tokyo. But I think we have different rules now. We have Godzilla and we have Mech Godzilla. We have Rodan. We have all sorts of other strange threats. The rules actually about how we think about water management, about even sustainability itself, are changing right now. And we need new approaches. We need to be able to manage with change. We need to be able to see the waves of uncertainty that are coming towards us and maybe be able to surf them. So. And that idea of managing for things like COVID or climate change, all kinds of things that are hard to predict, hard to quantify and be able to describe, that's what I think resilience is moving towards as a practice.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very rich metaphors. It sounds like the baseline is moving and there's no way to go back to where it was originally. We need to advance as systems change. So, Will, from your position as the director, I should say, the global lead of water sustainability at Amazon Web Services, from a private sector perspective, how is Amazon approaching this new normal?
Yeah. So briefly, Amazon Web Services operates data centers around the world. We're the largest cloud service provider. And we use water for cooling those data centers. So that's why we're thinking about water stewardship and our role within the communities as it relates to water. So I'd say there's a couple different areas that we think about. One is about our facilities, where we build them, whether we use water for cooling or not. We like to use water because it helps us dramatically reduce the energy that we use. So it makes it easier to meet our carbon goals, our renewable energy goals. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're managing water in a responsible manner. So we think carefully about where we put the data centers, about when and how much water we use. We always are trying to minimize that water usage, and so we're making investments in water efficiency. We're making investments to bring more sustainable sources of water, like recycled water, to use in cooling. We don't need to be using potable water for cooling data centers, and we would love to use recycled water everywhere we can. So we're thinking those decisions go into a lot of the kind of normal business planning in thinking about how we can contribute to long-term resilience in those communities where we're operating. Also within the water stewardship efforts, really thinking carefully about how can we tailor those to do the most to advance water resilience within those communities. Now, we should be having these conversations so that we can figure out what does that target look like. But already we're thinking about how we can invest in projects to improve water quality in those communities, to expand water access, and to ensure long-term balance between supply and demand. So, the question of where are we pointing towards, I think, can help us refining what are the types of projects that we're investing in. And we're trying to use as much data and technology as possible to make the best possible decisions for those watersheds.
Interesting. Some few bright spots there, new areas of opportunity that you brought out. So, Daniel, we heard sort of a cautionary tale from John here, but some areas, the Godzilla coming up, but some areas of opportunity increasingly that we're seeing come onto the market. You previously worked at the World Bank, so now you work in conservation, kind of with both hats on.
Yeah.
What do you think of this concept of watershed resilience, and where are those opportunities that you're seeing?
Yeah. Well, just to pick up on one of the monsters analogies here, when I think of resilience, I think a lot about, the one thing that we can't predict, which is like the variability in rainfall going forward in this century. And so maybe with my World Bank hat on, if I think back in the last century, built a lot of the water infrastructure that Amazon depends on, that we all depend on for our water, for flood mitigation, with some assumptions about rainfall patterns that are no longer basically as predictable as they were. So one kind of obvious thing, other than what Will just described in terms of reducing your own consumption, is also like some level of redundancy and diversity, especially around drinking water sources. That's something I think we're going to see a lot more of going forward. Is just, if you can't predict the future, you need to prepare for different futures. I think the other big trend you're going to see, or we should see more of, I should say, is really a much greater appreciation about where our water comes from. We'll allude to this not only in terms of the water work that Amazon does within its four walls, but also recognizing that Amazon and all water users are part of a basin, part of a community. And what happens to your neighbor kind of is happening to you. And so, at the Nature Conservancy, I think that looks like we have been pioneers in watershed conservation. In some cases, like in Cape Town, that looks like removing vegetation, right? So, we believe we've shown through our work and then demonstrated on the ground that actually doing watershed conservation at like significant scales, 54,000 hectares of watershed, you can add back to the water system something on the order of the equivalent of 2 months water supply. So that's, when the next drought comes, we don't know when exactly that'll be, but we know it's coming at greater frequency. There'll be more water in the system. But again, I don't think just watershed conservation is the panacea. I think that city needs to think about diversity.
Great. All right, guys. This is called The Water Sector Needs Grit. So let's talk about what grit means a little bit to you. John, what fundamental changes would you like to see in the coming future to help us prepare for this new normal?
Sure. Well, I feel like there's a lot that actually is being challenged by some of the new uncertainties right now. Things that maybe even that they became kind of fixed in our thinking about what water sustainability, what water targets should be, even from the early 20th and 19th century. And I think actually some of the evolution is quite natural and positive. I was really struck in your comments that you started off by talking about facilities and a kind of facility level risk. That's a kind of traditional water stewardship view. But you also then talked about the broader community impacts that actually that facility's resilience was in effect dependent on if your employees that they're working there, if their kids can go to school, if they feel safe in their homes, if they can take a shower, absolutely. Right? Yeah. And that's a very different kind of approach that I think is very different. But we also need to bring in build on practices like conservation that have worked for a long time, but maybe even move in kind of a post-conservation approach. Like actually, what are the emerging landscapes? We often think, especially with climate change or land use change, about ecological loss. But I would say, I'm a biologist, I would say actually what we're seeing is ecological disassembly and reassembly. And we have new landscapes that are forming, and it becomes a challenge, especially in a place like, say, Cape Town, the special Fynbos region, the special biome that's in that area. It's been in one kind of plateau for a long time, and it's becoming something else. We're not quite sure what that is, but we have to be able to track it, maybe anticipate it even. And those new normals are I think, the part that we really need to be able to bring in.
You brought up a lot of good points there around water sustainability and targets and kind of this post-conservation world, and I'd like to follow some of these a bit more. So, Will, around water sustainability and targets, corporates often use both of those to guide their water, basically their water risk strategies at where you work, particularly with Amazon. What would you like to see? I guess, what would you like to see in the future among your peers? What kind of changes would you like to see?
Yeah, historically, I think the model has been governments have responsibility for protecting through regulation or funding the key watersheds we rely on. And oftentimes it's been an adversarial approach between industry and government. And then you have some nonprofits on the side also throwing in and trying to make things better with the funding they have available. I think it can be a much more, cooperative relationship where corporates can help accelerate progress on these issues around water resilience. And what I want to see happen is I want us to accelerate progress. I want us to be less afraid of failing, spend less time, trying to get every piece of data in place before you do something. We should obviously be incorporating community input and making sure that we're not doing anything that's going to have a negative impact. But at the same time, I'd like to see us not only bring funding to accelerate progress on these topics, but also bring the expertise that we have. AWS has a lot of really neat digital tools built on the cloud platform that can help water utilities figure out where they're losing water in their system, that can help with water quality monitoring in a watershed. I'd like to see us, joining forces more to accelerate progress on these challenges.
Excellent. Daniel, I'm going to ask you sort of a thorny question. I apologize in advance.
Sure.
But John brought up this concept of a post-conservation world.
Yeah.
From the Nature Conservancy's perspective, how might this affect the way that we do, conservation business in the future?
Yeah. Well, I have to unpack I'll guess at what John means exactly there. But I think it dovetails a little bit about what Will was saying, that, a big feature going forward is that these systems are just not static. And so I think maybe what John's alluding to is, there's a historical idea of kind of protection. If we can just put a fence around nature, that's the best way to protect it. And I know that while we're concerned about the resilience of our water sources, of our families, nature, to John's point, is also going to be adapting to a changing climate.
Often faster than us.
Almost, faster and in ways that we can't always predict. And so, again, as Will is alluding to, I think the future, if it's post-conservation, is going to be one where your adaptive management goes hand in hand. But again, I think that's not at all incompatible with the way that a lot of our watershed conservation projects work right now. Right? We use models. You do the baseline monitoring, and then you adjust. If you're doing it right, you're making adjustments to those conservation strategies over time. Communities change. The FINBOS changes. I mean, those things are not static, and in some ways, I don't think they ever were. But now, with changing climate, we're reminded more than ever that static is not going to be the norm.
Well said. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. We're going to have to wrap up because we're short, but I invite everyone at home to continue the conversation. All of our panelists here brought up a lot of, thorny issues that we don't necessarily have the answers to yet, but we also have some bright spots, some hope for the future, and I continue to engage with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke.